If your only impressions of Portland, Oregon came from watching news coverage of protests downtown, you could maybe be forgiven for thinking of the entire city as a smoldering crater. But if you've lived in the city or spent any time at all exploring it, you know that where the city really shines is in its old close-in neighborhoods. So today we're going to take a tour of Portland's Inner East Side and talk about how the streetscapes that everyone loves are all a legacy of the city's long-demolished network of electric railways, and it's all coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer-suggested topics always welcome, but today's topic is one that's been on my mind for years. And it's not going to be an absolutely comprehensive review of the city's entire historic streetcar system because who's got time for that? But I am going to focus on several older neighborhoods and main streets whose very urban fabric, over a century later, is absolutely defined by the fixed route transportation investments that existed here over a century ago. Because, let's be real, if you were building a neighborhood from scratch at any point after the advent of the automobile, then this is what your neighborhoods and commercial areas look like. There's absolutely no reason to organize human activity around dense nodes and corridors if the assumption is that everyone has a car and everyone is going to drive everywhere to meet their daily wants and needs, which is, in fact, how a shocking number of our cities and suburbs are designed. So before we get started, let's acknowledge that this is a city visit video, which means, yes, it does have a narrative woven into it, as all my videos do. But I also accept that these videos function as urbanist travelogues of a sort, kind of like reference material for the type of people who are interested in the same aspects of cities that I'm interested in, so you can watch in advance of visiting or possibly even moving to a particular city yourself. To demonstrate some typical features of streetcar neighborhoods, let's start with Hollywood in Northeast Portland, where some of the original features still exist. Buildings with commercial storefronts and no setback from the sidewalk. Crucially, a movie theater, which you're going to see is a pretty standard feature of a lot of these kinds of streets, if they've actually been rescued from demolition, which a lot of theaters in the east side of Portland have. Okay, and this building with the Moorish elements, which you might think is just a barbecue joint, but it's actually over 100 years old and was a streetcar transfer point and ticket office at Sandy and 42nd. As you travel north on 42nd, you run into the Alameda Ridge and what I think is an endlessly fascinating urban feature. Public stairways constructed over 100 years ago that connect the neighborhoods above down to the streetcar stops and the Hollywood commercial district below. Public stairways exist all over Portland where there's proximity to old streetcar lines and rapid elevation changes. They aren't really signed at all, they're almost hidden, which is probably the way the homeowners like it, but they're super fun to seek out. The vestiges of an old streetcar system are like little Easter eggs all over many US cities. The Burnside Trolley Building, which is the old West Ankeny car barn, and the Portland Railway Light and Power Company Building, which is really the old Selwood Division car barn office and clubhouse, also very cool, served both the street railway and the interurbans, and functioned as a ticket office, a lost and found, and an office for company employees. I won't spend much time on the Springwater Corridor here, which is known today mainly as a trail alignment between inner southeast Portland and distant exurbs to the southeast. But just to point out that Oaks Amusement Park at the southern city limits is one of a vanishing number of trolley parks that street railway operators built to induce ridership on weekends. Cool skating rink, by the way. Southeast Belmont Street, where the Mount Tabor line ran. Great old commercial district, still mostly intact. It's a place lots of businesses want to set up shop, and some of the businesses that are here have been here for decades. Also, it's Portland, so we're declaring victory over racism 10 feet at a time. Hawthorne Boulevard, more vintage street railway commercial architecture. Movie theaters? Check. Street seating? Check. Mochi donut places. You know, if you want to find out what the latest trendy food thing is, just drop in on any of these streetcar neighborhoods. You're gonna see multiple of a lot of these things sprinkled all over the historic commercial corridors we're covering today. East Broadway, you really can tell where the streetcars ran. Just some beautiful storefronts. Normal stuff like tacos and bar studios, but package-free grocers, sports bars that feature women's sports exclusively. Southeast 13th down in Selwood, taverns that have been in business seemingly forever, yoga, food cart pods in the occasional spot where a vacant space still exists, Housing. On a lot of these streets, you haven't seen that much new density get built right on the corridor, but we will get to some exceptions later. Keep in mind, virtually all of these streets in the inner east side of Portland were built before the advent of the automobile. These are all rights of way that were constructed without the car in mind, so it's no surprise that when we see them without cars, that's when they feel like they're at their best. Further up into Sellwood, Milwaukee Avenue. By the way, this is not typical early April Portland weather. At one point I was waiting for a walk signal and the woman standing next to me mentioned how pretty the weather was, unlike the past, 6 months. And was I from here? Because neither was she. She was from Maryland. And just between you and me, she thinks the weather here makes people a little bipolar. I don't know, I don't want to pathologize it, and I'm not qualified to make a diagnosis, but I don't think she's probably that far off. Anyway, in case you were wondering, no, not every electric railway main street on the east side of Portland looks exactly the same. Inner East Burnside is characterized by arcaded buildings which date from the 1930s when the city wanted to add more traffic capacity on Burnside, and the solution was to repurpose the existing sidewalks as travel lanes and move the pedestrian right-of-way underneath the second floor of the buildings along the street. So we've literally been building in car dependence for 100 years. Pretty awesome. Okay, so I've shown you a lot of what you might call good urbanism in kind of an uncritical way, but in a minute I'm going to dig into some of the more deficient and problematic aspects of these inner east side streetcar suburbs, and a bit of a silver lining of optimism because that's what I do. But first, brief reminder to click on all the things if you're a fan of all the great urban fabric that the street railways left behind. Connect on the apps to keep up with where I'm at from week to week. I'm traveling a lot. And direct support on Patreon is really what makes it possible to keep doing what I'm doing every week. Real quick, let's go back to Milwaukee Avenue, this time a little further north in the Brooklyn neighborhood. Look, it's a theater. Yeah, this is why I was in Portland. Sold out show at the 620-seat Aladdin. Thanks so much to the folks at Portland State, especially Dr. Jennifer Dill, for inviting me out to do the event. And if you yourself are thinking about pursuing a master's in planning, I can definitely recommend PSU from firsthand experience. Oh, and here's the theater where we were originally supposed to have the event, on Clinton Street, not too far from the Aladdin, but it only holds like 200, so that wasn't gonna work. I'm way too big of a deal. Clinton Street was home to one of Portland's early electric railways and is now one of the most popular bikeways in the city, with just a fantastic commercial node at 26th Avenue. North Mississippi Avenue also featured one of the early electric railways, and this street is really a mix of older building stock and newer housing density. North Mississippi probably went through tougher times in the late 20th century than nearly any of these streets, with many of the buildings being abandoned and falling into disrepair, which explains why there's so much more opportunity for infill here than there is on some of the other streets we've looked at. But the architectural form is immediately recognizable as streetcar era. The Mississippi line that once ran here kind of functioned as an assurance of a constant flow of pedestrian traffic. So you got the bones of a compact, dense, built environment that developers continue to build on today. And every one of these neighborhoods we're looking at is immensely popular. Everyone wants to live near a street like Mississippi. And at the same time, it has to be noted that this is the Boise neighborhood and was predominantly black up until 15 or 20 years ago. It's really hard to talk about neighborhood revitalization and infill without talking about displacement, and I don't intend to shoehorn that entire discussion into this video, but I can't gloss over it and trust that I do have multiple topics on my list that touch on the subject. Northeast Alberta Street, similar story, and I'm afraid I have to point out that I saw by roughly an order of magnitude more murals and interpretive features with black people on them than I saw actual black people on Alberta Street. And I'm not trying to be preachy about this, it's just an observation. And I actually lived in this neighborhood in the early 2000s, so I'm sure I'm part of the problem. It really is a great street, and it has slowly filled in with new density over the last 30 years. Obviously a legacy streetcar corridor, otherwise why would I be showing you? And yes, you can be forgiven for thinking every one of these corridors has a Rudy's barber shop. In the case of the Alberta streetcar line, it actually took a turn up north on 30th Avenue, so you get one more nice little node up on 30th and Killingsworth. Again, these are streets that predate the automobile, and it is just really difficult to retrofit more recently developed streets to look like this, with a narrow footprint and an enclosed feel. The one downside here is that right-of-way is at a premium, and especially curb space. So the solution in Portland is often to put bikes on what we call a neighborhood greenway, a low-traffic residential street a block or two off the street where all the actual destinations are. In the case of Alberta, that's Going Street, and I like the Going Street Greenway, but I really want to see all the storefronts on Alberta while I'm biking. I mean, biking is such a great scale and speed to take in commercial destinations and services, and you do get that on another legacy electric railway street, Williams Avenue. As you ride it, you can actually see all the places that you might be interested in going. You don't have to memorize cross streets in advance, it's all right there in front of you. Lots of dense infill up and down the corridor, and yeah, this is another street where there's been a lot of displacement of historically black communities. But much more often, there are streets that are just missed opportunities, like Northeast 28th. When the city selected the route for the 20s low-stress bikeway several years ago, it was decided to route it away from 28th, mostly, I believe, over concerns from businesses about losing parking spots. So today, the bikeway is over on 30th, a residential street, and Rudy's Barbershop is on 28th. I don't know about you, but I honestly can't be bothered to remember which cross street my barber is on. And it is funny that they ended up taking a lot of the street parking out anyway after COVID hit and street seating turned out to be a winner. So maybe parking wasn't so important? Look, Portland is a really great bike city for the US, but it's by no means perfect. The bike routes aren't always where they really need to be, and the bike parking, there's still just far too much of it that people are taking artistic liberties with. Just install staple racks, people. Okay, one last historic electric railway corridor, Ankeny Street. Similar to Clinton in that it's largely residential with just compact nodes of commercial. The city converted the block between 27th and 28th into a car-free space around the onset of the pandemic. It's immensely popular, and you just wonder why all of our cities aren't just filled with stuff like this. One more stop on today's tour. I met up with Coach Sam Balto and his bike bus. If you don't know Coach Balto's story, I'll leave a link down in the description. He's a physical education teacher at Alameda Elementary, which, ironically, has to be one of the most topographically bike-unfriendly schools in the Portland Public Schools system. And I was aware of his program, which started after I left Portland, and I was intrigued. So when he invited me to come out and do a Wednesday morning ride-along, I imagined I was going to see like 20 kids out on bikes when I showed up, which to get that many would honestly be a win. But instead, I was just blown away by the absolute caravan that showed up. Parents, siblings, people riding along just for fun, including yours truly. Neighbors out on the sidewalk cheering the kids on. It's just a normal school morning. It's not a special event. Anyway, I encourage folks to read up on this. It's Coach Balto's program, and he's very good at articulating all the benefits, most of which are readily apparent, but for me, it's all about not just forming habits in kids at a young age, but really giving them a different perspective on how they can and should be using our streets, and really ingraining in them how good it feels to get around under your own power, not just physically, but socially too. Our older city streets are really just better the way they were originally meant to be, where the sounds you hear are just a joyful noise instead of the usual thing you hear around elementary schools these days, which is like idling engines in a school drop-off zone. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons for giving me the flexibility and the resources to get out to different cities and do events and share more of all the interesting and unique things that are going on in all of our cities. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.